Those of you who know me know that I don't do formal introductions because I'm not good at it, and B, I think people get bored when you start reading someone's bio. But John Ladd, this is my way of introducing John. He's a really big deal. And he's been a really big deal. That's the first line in his bio. He's been a really big deal in the apprenticeship world for like 25, 30 years. And until about a month or 6 weeks ago or so, he was the apprenticeship administrator. It's funny because in our world, that title wouldn't be administrator. What does that mean? But in the world of DOL, that's a really high-ranking position, that he was sort of in charge of apprenticeship and everything that came underneath it. And then about 6 weeks ago, he left the DOL and now works for Jobs for the Future, which is a very influential and very visible national workforce development organization. Part of what they do is apprenticeship. That's not all that they do. And so now he has a really interesting and unique perspective because he's been on the outside, he's been on the inside, and now he's on the outside. So we decided today that instead of him having to give a whole speech, we're going to do literally it'll sort of be a conversation, somewhere between a conversation and an interview. But I just want to start by telling you one story about John. So I got to meet John. He's worried. So I got to meet John when I was appointed to the Labor Secretary's Advisory Committee the ACA Advisory Committee on Apprenticeship. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know why I'd been appointed. They had never had early childhood represented on that committee. It was mostly labor, and it was mostly traditional. And this was a part of a move to get more non-traditional sectors into that body, and it made a difference. Nonetheless, it took a long time for me to figure out what I was doing and what was this all about. And the first thing that I remember about John, he's very soft-spoken. At least he was at the DOL. We don't know what's going to be now. We'll see. Now he could get a whole different reputation. But there was at this first meeting, there was a lunch. Everybody had to go out to lunch at some point because DOL can't pay for your meals. And he just invited me to come along with who I perceived as being the big kids table. And I was so excited, I could hardly breathe. And I remember because at lunch, they had a conversation like about trucking and I don't even know, highways. I couldn't even follow the conversation. But I was so excited to be at the table. I really was like a child in an adult environment. Now, some time passes, and I start to understand things, and then there was a big controversy that the committee was dealing with, and it had to do with whether low-wage industries should be included on the ACA or in the world of apprenticeship, not in the ACA, and whether there should be such a thing as stackable apprenticeships, all kinds of things that hit to the core of what we do. So at some point, and this is a group of 30 people, and then the leadership, John being right in the center of it. At some point I said, well, if all of this is really about wanting more, to build the equity of the apprenticeship world, that was the underlying push. So we know we want more people of color, we know we want more women, and so on and so forth. Why don't we just make it a rule? Why don't we just say, if your program doesn't have 45% female, you won't get approved. Your standards won't get approved. I said it sort of just like that, and John very quietly said, we can't do that, Randy. I said, well, why not? He said, well, it's illegal. I was like, dang. So that's somewhere in there is my introduction of my friend John. So let me bring him up to the stage. So since I did my version of an introduction, yes. So give them some more detail of who you are and what the path how you got to this place.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Randy. Really appreciate the invitation to be here. And before saying anything more about myself, I just want to thank you again for inviting me here today, but really for your leadership for ECE and for your work on the advisory committee. I hope you all know what a fierce, tireless leader you have for this movement and this cause. We had a lot of discussions on that committee, a lot of great discussions. It's not easy to go and bring the concerns and issues of one industry to this group that included people that have been doing apprenticeship for, their whole lives, right? And that for a lot of people, apprenticeship is seen as really kind of the domain of particularly the construction industry, right? Like that's where apprenticeship had its roots. And to take that group on and to bring another perspective and to fight for those causes and issues was really impressive. And I want to thank you for your leadership on that. As Randy mentioned, I'm the former administrator for the Office of Apprenticeship at DOL. I have about 30-year career at DOL. About half of that was in apprenticeship, and the other half before that was in the broader workforce system. I'd worked at the local level, worked in different jobs within DOL. And interestingly, my first time working on apprenticeship was when I became administrator for the Office of Apprenticeship. So, similar to you, I came into this world that had been very well, established and had its own sense of itself and was really rooted in kind of the mechanics and the needs of one particular industry, and kind of similar to ECE, did not have a major place at the table for workforce development broadly. So a lot of the things you talk about here were things that actually apprenticeship itself has gone through to be seen as really, a premier workforce development strategy. But I have spent about 30 years in workforce development, longtime native of Boston, and worked in the local Boston workforce system, but came to DOL after graduate school and worked at a number of different places within the agency, kind of different leadership positions before becoming the administrator for the office. And it was interestingly, someone pointed out to me later, maybe it's a question of my own self-awareness, but I have a personal connection to apprenticeship as well. When my father first came to this country, he started as an apprentice. He got his first real job as an apprentice, was a plumber, went on to become a master plumber and started his own business. But, it really kind of came full circle that even though I was very clearly not cut out for a career in plumbing, I still ended up back in a place that really gave my family and our family kind of its initial trajectory to be able to, establish ourselves here in the U.S. and to support, or for my father to support, me and our family. So there's a long connection there to apprenticeship, but it wasn't where I started, but it's been an amazing, amazing journey over the past 10, 15 years.
Thank you. So you mentioned that historically, when you think of apprenticeship, you think of construction. And what folks here may not realize is over the past, 10 years or so, there was this intentional effort to modernize, that's the word they used, modernize the apprenticeship system. So can you talk a little bit about what that means and how that sort of unfolded?
Sure. Yeah, Randy is exactly right. I'm actually curious, how many people in the room here have been working loosely in any way related to apprenticeship for more than 10 years? Okay, a few people. How about more than 5 years? All right, and then more than 2 years, presumably everybody else. Okay, all right, that's good to know. So, Randy's exactly right. When I came into the office, apprenticeship was really seen as this niche workforce program serving the needs of the construction industry, and was clouded in this language that really, unless you were part of that world, you really didn't understand. Things like joint apprenticeship training committees and labor management partnerships and journey workers and ratios and all the stuff that no one really understood. So it was difficult to understand, and it was difficult to, it wasn't very accessible, I think, to the rest of the workforce system that, really didn't do a lot of work-based learning. Most of it was, the traditional model of you train someone first and then you place them. And this idea of earn while you learn just really kind of created a lot of cognitive dissonance, I think, for people because they just couldn't get how the model worked. So we had that combined with, the fact that we had no federal funding. Prior to 2015, 2016, there was no federal investment in apprenticeship other than a small amount of funds that was used to fund my staff, right, just to have an Office of Apprenticeship. But there were no grants, there were no intermediaries, there was none of that. And if you have no money in Washington, D.C., you're pretty irrelevant, right? You really aren't seen as a player in the workforce system. So we had a lot of work to do to try to first just gain some recognition and visibility for our apprenticeship, and we can probably talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the first things we knew we had to do was kind of build the evidence base around apprenticeship and show people the outcomes. We had to make it easier to understand and easier to understand and easier to start, right? That, again, people didn't understand the jargon, people didn't understand the language, and people didn't know how to get started. So, even if you could sell somebody on the idea that apprenticeship made some sense, people wouldn't know how to get started or how to do the work. So, a lot of work went into really trying to reduce the paperwork, make it simpler, make it easier to understand, create new models. But we knew funding was going to be an important part of this. And so funding came along in 2015, 2016. And really that initial funding was trying to create these proofs of concept, right? That this could work outside of the construction industry, that we can create new and innovative models, that different program designs, different partnership structures, pretty much everything that we knew about apprenticeship, we wanted to keep the core elements of what apprenticeship is, but allow it to innovate and allow it to change its form to be able to meet the needs of that particular industry. So we introduced things like intermediaries, which is now a common accepted practice that DOL or a state apprenticeship agency can't do it all. We had to create more flexibility in the models. Things like allowing the classroom instruction to happen on the front end versus kind of simultaneously, with the on-the-job learning. That was questioned, early on. Using competency and hybrid models, all these different innovations and different flexibility that we wanted to add to the system that people accept today is pretty well, pretty well needed and pretty well accepted pretty broadly now. That took time, and that wasn't something that people just were ready to accept right away.
Great, thank you. As you know, but I don't know if everyone else does, in April, the Trump administration issued 2 executive orders which offer significant promise for apprenticeships. So can you talk about the focus and the potential impact of those orders, and in particular, how it might impact industries like ECE, pre-K to 12 education, and low-wage essential industries?
Yeah, so these are big deals and pretty exciting in the apprenticeship world. And there were 2 executive orders. I'll probably talk mostly about the second one. The first one was around artificial intelligence, and that executive order did have some language around using apprenticeship. But really more broadly, that executive order was this recognition that we needed to bring AI into the classroom, and that there needs to be how students learn, that AI needs to be incorporated into their education and into the curriculum. What I think was not said in there, and I think is important, is I think it's also kind of implicitly asserting that there needs to be a greater connection between education and career preparation, right? That ultimately, as students go out into the world, they're going to have to understand how to use AI as part of that, part of the world of work and in their ongoing education. And I think that's kind of some of the bigger, broader implications for workforce in that executive order. The second executive order really was much more focused directly on workforce development and apprenticeship. And it has 2 big strands if you haven't dug into it too much. One is probably maybe a little more concerning. It talked about the broader workforce system, and in that, and that was later kind of confirmed with the president's budget outline that was submitted last week, I believe. that part of the executive order really talks about trying to consolidate many of the existing job training programs and turning a lot of those funds over to governors and states to be able to use to advance their workforce development strategies. I think you can think different things about consolidated grants to states, but I think the concern was many other existing programs were being eliminated and being bundled together into this new grant. So I think there's some concern that there's no additional funding being provided to support that broader state strategy, and some existing programs that are serving particular needs and particular populations are being eliminated. But the second part of that executive order was pretty exciting for apprenticeship, and it does a couple of things that I think are really important. The first is it mentions registered apprenticeship, and I think that was a big question, right, up until those executive orders came out, which was, which direction was this administration going to go? If, for those of you who have been around during the first Trump administration, they had introduced kind of an alternative model of apprenticeship called IRAPs, and we won't get into all those details, but the question was whether IRAPs or some other alternative or some new form or some new idea was going to come on the table, and that we were going to go in a completely new direction. And I think that's been one of the big challenges that apprenticeship has had over the last decade or so, is that we've had a lot of interest, we've had a lot of focus, we've had a lot of investment, but we haven't had a consistent and concerted effort to kind of sustain the progress that's been built. Right? We've had 3 different and now 4 different administrations over the last 10, 12 years, and each one, even though they've generally supported apprenticeship, obviously have different priorities and different policies that they put in place. And so you lose a lot of momentum, right, as you're trying to build towards one particular set of policies and direction, and then you have to kind of step back and restart all over again. So we really haven't had 10 or 12 years of uninterrupted progress. We've had like these 3 or 4 year spurts or sprints to try to advance apprenticeship. But that is one of the really good things about that executive order, is it did put its weight behind registered apprenticeship, so it removes all this uncertainty, right, which I think is really, really important. There's still uncertainty around, specific forms of funding, but knowing that we're not going to go down a new path and try to reinvent the wheel, I think is really, really important. As we try to get employers on board, as we try to get employers to commit, they need that certainty. They need to know that there's going to be consistency moving forward. So it does kind of double down on registered apprenticeship, which is what our office and the states managed. It also set a goal. It set a goal of 1 million active apprentices. We're about 680,000 active apprentices today. And that number doubled from about the time that I was in that office. So now we're looking at about another 50% increase on top of that. So it's an ambitious goal, but a doable goal. Interestingly, there's not a timetable attached to that goal. It just says 1 million apprentices. It doesn't tell us by when, so that's a good thing, someday. That goal is important, and within that goal, it very explicitly, again, talks about the need to expand into new, non-traditional, and emerging high-growth sectors. So I think that's the important element for ECE. I think the other context for this, and sorry I'm going on a bit longer here, but I think there's broad recognition that these executive orders should really be seen in the context of a lot of the debate right now around tariffs and reshoring jobs back to the U.S., right? I think whatever you think about the approach or strategy, if these jobs are to come back to the U.S., there has to be a workforce here, right, to do those jobs. And I think it's also pretty clear that we are struggling to meet the jobs that are already here and filling those jobs. And if more jobs come back to the U.S., it's going to be even a greater struggle. Through the past 2 or 3 administrations, I can't tell you how many industries came to DOL and told us how they are struggling to find a skilled workforce. Randy mentioned the trucking challenge. We did a trucking challenge. We did a manufacturing challenge. We did a cyber challenge. We could have done a challenge every couple months. We were exhausted by the end of it. But every industry had the same story, right? They couldn't find qualified workers. Their turnover was high. They were losing people. The workforce was aging. There weren't enough new people coming in that were ready to take over those jobs. And so apprenticeship increasingly was seen as an answer, to a lot of those challenges. But I do think, the primary focus of those executive orders are really around this, how we be ready to support these industries if they come back to the U.S. and have that skilled workforce to do that. But, as Randy has often made the case, ECE is the glue for the economy across every sector. And if you can make that connection between, reshoring and bringing jobs back to the U.S. and needing a workforce, you can easily make the connection between, if we're bringing those jobs back, we need to have the care economy workforce behind it ready to support those workers as they move into those jobs as well. So I think there's still a challenge and work to be done there, but I think there's definitely an opportunity.
Great, thank you very much. We want to get to some questions very specifically about the challenges we face in this whole world. But I know from the current position from which you sit, there's a couple of things you wanted to be able to highlight that this group would find relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. There's still a lot of uncertainty around federal direction right now, right? And I think a lot of the activity is happening at the state level and other places. But, I am so excited to have joined Jobs for the Future, and I think organizations like JFF and others are really stepping into that breach as well. And there's a couple of things, I would love to highlight. Just last week during National Apprenticeship Day, we issued a blueprint for expanding and modernizing apprenticeship in the U.S. And it's a lot of the things that we've been talking about already, how better use of the federal funding, expanded use of intermediaries, growing youth apprenticeship, things where there are a lot of consensus around where the apprenticeship system needs to go. But the second thing that JFF also announced last week was this partnership with Google to create a national apprentice fund. And this is funding available for apprentices. I'm not sure if folks heard about it, but last week we did a webinar. This is a fund available to any registered apprentice across the country. It's a $2,800 essentially stipend or grant with the idea of those funds being available to support their apprentice complete their apprenticeship. We're really trying to push apprenticeship completion. We know there are higher returns and wage gains for complete, but I think this would have really important relevance for the ECE workforce because it could also be used as a wage supplement and a wage stipend, but it could be used for childcare needs, transportation needs, supplies. It's really very no strings attached funding that can help support that apprentice and to make sure that they complete their apprenticeship.
Great, thank you. And I think if we're talking about the same thing, the apprentice actually applies.
I think the apprentice applies with their sponsor.
Yeah. But it's not a thing where the employer.
The employer doesn't.
$100,000 and dole it out.
Right.
Great. Okay. So we're not going to talk about that. Okay. So we're going to go on to the things that are more specific to ECE. There's three challenges that I wanted to highlight, and you'll weave your response.
Sure.
Okay. The first is. One of the things that the biggest challenge we face in trying to advance apprenticeship for the world of ECE is that we are a low-wage industry. And so basically what we're told is, why should we invest in you? You don't pay well. The whole goal of apprenticeship is to put people on a middle-class pathway. And from my vantage point, to do so in industries which don't require all that much training, considering how much money you could make at the end of it. Where ECE requires years of training and often BA degrees, and at the end of it, you get minimum wages. What's wrong with that, equation? Although I will say, that's starting wages. There is a career ladder. Everybody in this room probably is evidence of that career ladder. Okay, so anyways, now I'm being wordy, sorry. So, but the challenge is, how do we sort of push back, or what do we do about the fact that there is this push not to want to invest in low-wage industries? Okay, the second one is, like I said, there is this career ladder. For apprenticeships, when you can build a stackable set of apprenticeships, not apprentices, so that somebody comes in where they can handle it, and then as they get some success under their belt, then you say, hey, if you want to keep, now that you've finished, if you want to keep going, we have a program that gets you to an AA degree, and then you could earn XYZ, and you could assume position ABC, and then beyond that, which is generally, we call it stackable apprenticeships. There's pushback about that. And what I've gathered is the idea is you should be able to do one apprenticeship, finish your one apprenticeship, and be in a job that pays well and puts you on a good career path, and that's the end of it. And John and I had, I don't know if you remember, we had this conversation. John said, why can't you just embed that stackable thing, just make it one long apprenticeship that'll take 4 or 5 years? And my response was, because people won't do it. You can't tell someone who's never gone to college, if you just stick with us for 6 years, you will have a BA degree. Oh, and by the way, it's only offered in English, and so forth and so on, right? So it's just not a practical way to do it. So that's the second thing about stackable.
Yeah.
And then the third is, then there's this thing about quality jobs. And they want to convince me that ECE is not quality jobs. And then I pull out these things from the internet that tell you the 6 characteristics of quality jobs, and we hit every single one except wages. So my thing, of course, and you all, those of you who know me know this, it's like, it's not our fault we don't have the money for the wages. Let's talk about funding ECE. But let's not get confused that that's not a quality job. And so, again, these are all things of how do we navigate these challenges?
Yeah, these are the tough questions, and you know, Brandy knows from our conversations at the advisory committee that there's no easy answers to these. But you know, I'll just say kind of personally how I feel. You know, we should think about it. No guarantee that that's the consensus way forward, but you know, on the wages. You know, personally, I always felt uncomfortable with the idea that we would just ignore or abandon, you know, any segment of the population that was interested in moving ahead. And you know, and also just from our apprenticeship and public service background, you know, it's very hard to say no to somebody. And so we felt that we needed to serve everybody, and we strongly believed in that. I always felt like you can't expect apprenticeship to, you know, it's kind of the tail wagging the dog, right? It can't change the entire dynamics of an entire industry. It can help, but you know, we don't have the numbers yet. We don't have the influence yet that it can change the whole, you know, labor dynamics of a particular sector. What I would hope would be that rather than saying there's some, you know, wage that everybody has to hit, you know, I think we should be looking at, can apprenticeship increase the wages of those individuals relative to that industry? And if you can do that, then you are improving the working conditions and the job quality for those jobs. So, and I think if you can't do that, then I do think you'd probably have a question as to whether it makes sense to, whether, if someone's going to make the same wages, whether they do an apprenticeship or not, then I think you might have a stronger case that apprenticeship might not be the right model. But if after investing, the employer investing, the individual investing in the workforce, at the end, that should result in higher wages relative to the industry. So that's how I would want to think about the wages overall. In terms of stackable credentials, again, this is my personal view. You know, I think we have to distinguish between stackable apprenticeships kind of within an occupation and across an occupation. And I think where we never got to in those conversations was trying to think about them across an occupation. And some of it comes back to this idea, for some reason in the US, we have this kind of one-size-fits-all approach when we think about apprenticeship, that every apprenticeship is the same as every other apprenticeship, and most other countries don't think about it that way, right? They have levels of apprenticeship, and we think about that in education. An associate's degree is different than a bachelor's degree. And so there should be ways that we can think about different apprenticeships and think about, are those, what kind of educational level or what kind of even just, intensity of training are they equivalent to? A one-year apprenticeship is not the equivalent to something, that takes 4 or 5 years to complete. So how do we distinguish meaningfully between those different types of apprenticeship and then create those career ladders that allow people to move up and, with that, be able to increase their wages? So, I would love to see something like that in the U.S., and I think there's some growing interest in that, and some of that's coming from the youth apprenticeship world, right, where youth apprenticeship models tend to be a little bit less rigorous, a little less, occupationally specific focused, right? Because you're dealing with somebody that tends to be in high school, who's has a full-time high school workload and course load, so can't work full-time. You're not really preparing those people for a career that they're ready to walk in on day one. It's broader career exploration and broader exposure to an industry or a specific occupation, but it's not the same as doing a 4-year electrician apprenticeship or some other form of apprenticeship. So I think there's space to be able to think about how do we create these kind of apprenticeship pathways where pre-apprenticeship can lead into an apprenticeship, where youth apprenticeship can lead into structured apprenticeship, and where maybe a 1 or 2 year apprenticeship can more clearly articulate into a 3 or 4 year apprenticeship, and where you're going to get credit for that prior learning and that credit for that prior experience into those pathways.
Great, thank you. I'm going off script because I want to ask you a question. Do we have time? Oh, I'll ask a question. I want to ask you a question about what you said about wages. Are you saying that in other industries, I want to think of things that aren't labor-driven, so let's say tech, that someone who's in an apprenticeship, finishes an apprenticeship, and gets hired as a full-time employee at this position, are you saying that someone else who came through some other pathway and is also interviewing for that position, that the apprentice is going to get paid more than that other person?
No.
I didn't think so.
No.
Okay.
No. Typically, the way apprenticeship will work is that you're taking lower wages as you're an apprentice, and you're working your way up to whatever that standard is within that employer, right? So that everybody within that employer would be making the same wage, whichever path they come into, and at whichever point they're considered kind of a fully proficient, in that occupation.
Okay, I misunderstood how you explained it. And I would say the way we think about it is, the thing about apprenticeship, yes, it is paid. I mean, that's essential, right? Nobody should be doing that much work and that much effort without being paid. And you do get raises as you go through it, so all that. But that the sparkle to the apprenticeship is that when you have these two candidates, the apprenticeship is the best prepared, most ready, most skilled, and they're the best candidate. And for the employer, that. You just trained them for the past 2 years. You know exactly who you're getting, and it's all that.
Absolutely, and we hear that all the time from employers, that the apprentices outperform, maybe their pathways where they're hiring people directly from college or elsewhere. But it's because of exactly what you said, that they've been learning and absorbing the company culture, the particular processes that company uses, the way they do it. We often hear that when they bring in someone from the outside, they have to untrain them in how they've been doing it before. So, and when someone graduates from an apprenticeship program, it's the employer certifying that they're fully proficient now. So that employer has that guarantee that that person is fully ready to do the job, so that it's a built-in 100% guarantee on the training and development that they're doing. So absolutely, it's part of the big value proposition for employers.
Great, excellent. Okay, I can't believe it. It is 10:15. That was amazing. So thank you very much.